They called him Nurse Thorne, or when they thought he couldn't hear, they called him the Ghost. For 3 years, Elias Thorne had haunted the halls of the St. Jude's General Pediatric Ward, a silent, shuffling figure in cheap, perpetually wrinkled scrubs. He did the work no one else wanted. He cleaned up the messes, changed the soiled linens, calmed the inconsolable toddlers at 3 a.m. with a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from a place of deep, ancient weariness. He endured the casual cruelties of his superiors, the condescending pats on the shoulder, the eye rolls, the open mockery. They saw a man in his late 40s, prematurely grey, with a tremor in his left hand and a slight, dragging limp. They saw failure. A man who, at his age, was still at the bottom rung of the medical ladder. They didn't know that the limp was a gift from a 7.62mm round in the Kunar Valley. They didn't know the tremor wasn't a weakness of nerve, but the contained memory of a trigger pull, the ghost of 1,000 life-or-death decisions made in seconds. They didn't know the raspy voice was the product of a shrapnel-scarred larynx, an injury sustained while shielding a wounded comrade from a grenade blast. They didn't expect the day the sterile, quiet halls of the children's ward would echo with the flat, brutal crack of gunfire. They didn't expect the polished linoleum floors to be smeared with the evidence of sudden, shocking violence. And they certainly didn't expect the quiet, shuffling ghost to become the most dangerous thing in the entire building. Elias Thorne wasn't what he appeared to be. He wasn't a failed nurse. He was a retired master sergeant, a former special operations combat medic, a Tier 1 operator from a unit whose name was only ever spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the highest echelons of military power. He was a killer, a savior, a legend, hiding in plain sight. And the men who had just stormed his ward, armed with automatic rifles and cold intent, had no idea they were already dead. They had just locked themselves in a cage with a tiger who had spent 3 years pretending to be a house cat. The air in the ward was about to change. The silence that followed the initial screams wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of the hunt beginning. The fluorescent lights of the 4th-floor pediatric ward hummed with an oppressive, sterile monotony. It was a sound Elias had come to associate with a different kind of quiet dread than the one he'd known before. Not the silence of a desert night before an assault, but the slow, grinding dread of institutional bureaucracy and petty tyrants. The air, thick with the smell of antiseptic cleaner and the faint, sweet scent of children's soap, was a constant reminder of the fragile lives that passed through these halls. Today, that air was particularly charged, made heavy by the presence of Dr. Alastair Finch. Dr. Finch was the head of pediatrics, a man sculpted from privilege and polished by arrogance. Tall, with a mane of silver hair that looked expensively maintained, and a jawline that could have been carved by a master sculptor, he moved through the ward not like a healer, but like a feudal lord inspecting his domain. His white coat was always impossibly pristine, his shoes gleamed, and the Patek Philippe on his wrist was worth more than Elias's car. He didn't walk, he strode. He didn't speak, he pronounced. "Thorne!" Finch's voice cut through the low murmur of the nurse's station, sharp and dismissive. "Room 412. The child's vomited again. See to it. And for God's sake, try not to look so morose while you're doing it. It's depressing for the patients." A few of the younger nurses, sycophants in training, giggled behind their hands. Elias didn't react. He simply gave a slow, measured nod, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Finch's shoulder. Yes, Dr. Finch. His voice was a low rasp, gravelly and quiet. It was another thing Finch liked to mock. Speak up, man, honestly, it's like listening to a death rattle, Finch said with a theatrical sigh, turning to his audience of nurses. How this man ever passed his nursing exams is beyond me. They didn't know that Elias had performed a field cricothyrotomy with a Leatherman tool and the ink tube from a pen under sustained enemy fire. They didn't know he could diagnose complex trauma from the sound of a man's breathing in the dark. He held a doctorate in battlefield medicine from an institution that didn't have a campus, only a kill count. But here, at St. Jude's, his DD 214 and his commendations were just pieces of paper. His credentials were the mop and the bucket. As Elias moved toward room 412, his limp was more pronounced than usual. The damp weather always made the metal fragments still embedded in his hip ache with a dull, insistent throb. He passed room 407, where a small, pale girl named Lily was sleeping. Her file said she was Anna Smith, admitted for a complex post-operative recovery from a rare congenital heart defect. Her mother, a woman with haunted eyes who never left her daughter's side, sat in the visitor's chair, staring out the window. Elias knew the look. He'd seen it on the faces of civilians in war zones, the look of someone living on a knife's edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The name was a pseudonym. The security detail, disguised as hospital maintenance, was too professional, too watchful. This wasn't a normal patient. This was a package, and packages drew predators. Later that afternoon, Finch was holding court in the hallway, pontificating about a difficult diagnosis. It's clearly a case of atypical Kawasaki disease, he announced, loud enough for the entire wing to hear. The persistent fever, the rash, the elevated inflammatory markers. It's textbook. Elias was passing by, carrying a tray of used instruments. He paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes catching the chart Finch was holding. He saw the platelet count, dangerously low. He saw the specific pattern of the rash described in the nurse's notes. It wasn't textbook Kawasaki, it was the opposite. It was a contraindication. The standard high-dose aspirin treatment for Kawasaki would cause a catastrophic bleed in a patient with that platelet level. Quietly, almost a whisper, he said, "Sir, check for heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. The patient was on a heparin drip post-op 2 weeks ago." The hallway went silent. Finch froze, the chart held aloft like a holy tablet. He turned his head slowly, his handsome face contorting into a mask of pure fury. To be corrected was an insult. To be corrected by him, it was an act of war. "What did you say?" Finch's voice was low and menacing. "The platelet count, sir," Elias rasped, not meeting his eyes. "It suggests a paradoxical reaction to the heparin. Aspirin would be inadvisable." Finch snatched the chart back, his knuckles white. He stared at it, his eyes scanning the numbers. The air crackled. The other doctors and nurses held their breath. They were witnessing the unthinkable. The ghost was questioning the god. A slow flush crept up Finch's neck. The ghost was right. He slammed the chart against a nurse's chest. "Get a hematology consult, now!" he barked, not at Elias, but at the general vicinity. Then he rounded on Elias, his face inches away. The smell of his expensive cologne was suffocating. "You are a junior nurse, Thorne. You do not offer diagnoses. You do not question my judgment. You clean up vomit, and you push wheelchairs. Do you understand me? One more word out of line, one more whisper of your unsolicited, uneducated opinion, and I will personally see to it that you are not even qualified to empty trash cans in this city. Am I clear?" "Clear, sir," Elias whispered, his eyes on the floor. Finch gave him a look of profound disgust, then swept away down the hall, his entourage of residents trailing behind him like pilot fish. The tension broke. The nurses went back to their work, whispering furiously. Elias stood for a moment, motionless. He wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury, an indulgence. What he felt was cold. It was the same cold, clear feeling he'd had before, the feeling that told him the environment was unstable, that protocols were failing, that the people in charge were liabilities. And liabilities in his world always led to casualties. He took a deep, slow breath, the antiseptic smell filling his lungs, and continued on his way. The hospital hummed on, oblivious. But a line had been crossed. The system had shown its weakness. And somewhere, outside the sterile bubble of St. Jude's, the predators were watching. The afternoon bled into a grim, grey evening. A storm had rolled in off the coast, a tempest of biblical proportions that lashed the hospital windows with sheets of rain. The wind howled a mournful, low dirge, a fitting soundtrack for the mounting tension inside the pediatric ward. Dr. Finch, still smarting from the earlier humiliation, had made it his personal mission to make Elias's life a living hell for the remainder of his shift. He assigned him every foul task imaginable, from debriding a particularly nasty bedsore to manually disimpacting an elderly patient transferred from geriatrics. Each order was delivered with a sneer, a public performance of dominance for the benefit of the staff. Elias accepted each task with the same unnerving calm. His face remained a placid, unreadable mask. He just nodded, whispered, "Yes, sir," and went about his work with a quiet, methodical efficiency that seemed to enrage Finch even further. The doctor wanted a reaction. He wanted Elias to break, to complain, to give him a legitimate reason to fire him. But Elias offered him nothing. It was like punching water. Around 7 p.m., Elias was in the small kitchenette, wiping down the counters. His hip ached ferociously with the drop in barometric pressure. He allowed himself a rare moment of introspection, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The glass showed a tired man, flanked by the ghostly image of swaying trees and the frantic, slanting rain. He thought of Lily, Anna Smith, in room 407. He'd checked on her an hour ago, under the guise of delivering fresh water. The girl was asleep, her breathing shallow but regular. Her mother, however, was a tightly wound coil of anxiety, her eyes constantly darting towards the door. She'd flinched when Elias entered. He recognized the hypervigilance. She was expecting trouble. His instincts, honed by years of survival in places where trouble was the default state, screamed that she was right to be worried. He was just finishing up when Dr. Finch stormed in, his face a thundercloud. He was holding a small, empty paper cup. "Thorne!" he bellowed. "Where is my espresso?" Elias turned slowly. "Sir?" "My espresso. I asked Nurse Davies to have you fetch me a double espresso from the doctor's lounge machine an hour ago. I have a consult with the board in 10 minutes, and I require caffeine. Where is it?" Elias's mind, a finely tuned machine for processing information, replayed the last hour. Nurse Davies had indeed fluttered by, muttering something he hadn't quite caught as he was dealing with a biohazard spill. It was a classic Finch power play, relaying an order through a third party to maximize the potential for failure and plausible deniability. "I apologize, Doctor. I didn't receive the message clearly," Elias said, his voice a low rasp. Incompetence. Utter, staggering incompetence, Finch spat, throwing the paper cup into the sink with a clatter. You can't even be trusted to perform the simplest of errands. What earthly good are you? Look at you. He gestured with a dismissive wave of his hand, taking in Elias's worn scrubs, his tired posture. A pathetic, broken-down old man playing dress-up as a nurse. My God, it's embarrassing. Just get out of my sight. Go make yourself useful. Go check the linen closets, count the bedpans, something a man of your limited capacities can handle. Finch swept out of the kitchenette, leaving a wake of charged silence. Elias stood perfectly still, his gaze on the small, crushed paper cup in the sink. He felt the tremor in his left hand begin, a familiar vibration. He didn't clench his fist to stop it. He simply observed it, a detached scientist studying a specimen. He catalogued the insult, filed it away with the others. The accumulation was reaching a critical point. The pressure was building. In his old life, this was the moment before the breach, the moment the world held its breath. He turned to leave the kitchenette, his duty to count the bedpans clear in his mind. As he stepped into the main corridor, two things happened at once. The main power flickered, plunging the ward into a half-second of total darkness before the emergency generators kicked in with a low, guttural groan, casting everything in the eerie, dim glow of backup lighting. In that same instant, from the far end of the hall by the main access elevators, came a sound that did not belong. Not the beep of a monitor or the squeak of a cart. It was the sharp, metallic clack of a magnetic lock being forced, followed by a splintering crash. Then came the screams. Short, sharp, and cut off with brutal finality. The nurses at the station froze, their faces turning into masks of confusion and fear. Dr. Finch, who had been striding toward his office, stopped dead in his tracks. What in God's name was that? He demanded of no one in particular. Elias didn't freeze. He didn't gasp. He didn't look confused. The moment the sound hit his ears, his posture changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was total. The slight slump in his shoulders vanished. His head came up, his gaze instantly sharp and analytical. The tired, shuffling ghost was gone. In his place stood something else, something hard and ancient and terrifyingly awake. Through the double doors at the end of the hall, three figures emerged. They were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas. They carried short-barreled rifles, holding them with a professional, steady grip. One of them raised his weapon and fired a single, deafening shot into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down. Pop, pop, pop. The sound was flat, ugly. The lead attacker shot out the main nurse's station monitor and the overhead camera. Precise. Efficient. "Nobody move! Everybody on the floor now!" the lead attacker yelled, his voice distorted by the mask. Panic erupted. Nurses screamed and dove for cover. A visiting father grabbed his child and scrambled under a desk. But Dr. Finch just stood there, paralyzed, his handsome face slack with disbelief. His world of credentials and authority had just been shattered by the simple, brutal physics of a bullet. The attackers advanced down the hall, their boots making heavy, purposeful sounds on the linoleum. They were not common criminals. They moved like a fire team, coordinated, purposeful. Their eyes scanned the room numbers. They were looking for something, or someone. Elias didn't get on the floor. He didn't scream. He simply took one step back, melting into the shadows of the kitchenette doorway. His mind was no longer processing insults or fetching coffee. It was a whirlwind of tactical calculations. Three hostiles, armed with what looked like SIG MCX Rattlers, standard 5.56 millimeters. Body armor. Coordinated. Objective. Room 407. Lily. The package. The ward was a kill box. The exits were compromised. The staff were liabilities. Finch was a statue of useless terror. The lead attacker's gaze swept the hallway and locked onto Finch. "You! Doctor! Where is room 407? Finch could only stammer, pointing a trembling finger down the hall. "There." The attacker nodded to his comrades. They began to move toward Lily's room. In that moment, Elias Thorne made a decision. For 3 years, he had been a ghost. Now, it was time to become a reaper. The world slowed to a crawl. For Elias, the cacophony of fear, the whimpering, the distant sirens just beginning to wail, faded into a dull hum. His senses, long suppressed, flared to life with an intensity that was almost painful. He could smell the cordite in the air, the sharp tang of ozone from the shattered electronics, the sour scent of Dr. Finch's sweat from 10 feet away. He saw the way the attackers moved, the slight cant of the lead man's rifle, the way the third man, the tail gunner, kept his head on a swivel, his sector of fire discipline momentarily lax as he focused on the screaming nurses. It was a mistake. A small one, but it was enough. Elias moved. The limp was gone, erased by a surge of adrenaline and muscle memory so profound it was like a different man had taken over his body. He wasn't Nurse Thorne anymore. He was Master Sergeant Thorne. He flowed out of the kitchenette doorway, not a shuffle, but a predator's glide. He had no weapon. It didn't matter. The environment was the weapon. His path took him behind a large, rolling crash cart. The tail gunner, distracted by Finch's blubbering, didn't see him. Elias's hand, the one that trembled, shot out and gripped a heavy steel oxygen tank chained to the side of the cart. With a single explosive twist of his wrist, he snapped the cheap metal chain. The sound was lost in the general chaos. The attacker was 5 feet away. Elias didn't hesitate. He swung the dense steel tank in a low, brutal arc. It wasn't a wild swing. It was a precise, targeted strike. The tank connected with the attacker's knee with a sickening, wet crunch. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as his leg buckled sideways at an impossible angle. His rifle clattered to the floor. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. Before the man even hit the ground, Elias was on him. One hand chopped down on the man's wrist, pinning the hand that was reaching for a sidearm. His other hand, holding a freshly acquired, saline-filled 10 cubic centimeter syringe he'd palmed from the cart, drove the needle deep into the soft tissue of the man's neck, right into the carotid sheath. He depressed the plunger. It wasn't saline anymore. He'd injected 10 cubic centimeters of air. A massive air embolism. It was a death sentence that would take about 90 seconds to complete. Silent. Efficient. It wouldn't show up on an immediate autopsy without a specific search. A ghost's work. One down. The other two attackers spun around at their comrade's scream, rifles coming up. Pop, pop, pop! Bullets stitched across the crash cart, shredding bags of IV fluid and punching through the thin metal. But Elias was already gone. He'd used the downed man's body as a shield, rolling behind the nurse's station. "Contact! Rear!" the leader yelled. The professional calm in his voice was gone, replaced with a sharp edge of surprise. From his new position, Elias's mind was a supercomputer. He saw Nurse Davies, the one who'd failed to pass on Finch's message, huddled behind the desk, white with terror. He saw Dr. Finch, still frozen in the middle of the hallway like a terrified mannequin. "Doctor!" Elias's voice was no longer a rasp. It was a low, command-level bark that cut through the air like a razor. "Get down, now!" The sheer, unexpected authority in his voice shocked Finch into motion. He stumbled and fell to the floor, crawling clumsily behind a decorative planter. Elias's eyes scanned the station. A tangle of wires, a heavy-duty hole punch, a pair of surgical shears in a sterilization pouch. He grabbed the shears. His fingers, deft and sure, tore open the pouch. The two remaining attackers were advancing cautiously now, using a leapfrog formation. They were professionals, caught off guard, but recovering. They were communicating with hand signals. One pointed towards room 407. The objective was still the priority. Elias knew he had to stop them from reaching that door. Inside, a terrified mother and a vulnerable child were trapped. He looked at Nurse Davies. Her eyes were wide, fixated on him. She'd seen what he did to the first attacker. She wasn't seeing the ghost anymore. She was seeing a monster. "Give me your belt," Elias commanded, his voice low and urgent. She fumbled with the buckle of her leather belt, handing it to him with a trembling hand. He took it, looped it through the handles of the surgical shears, creating a makeshift flail. Crude, but effective in close quarters. The attackers were separating. One was covering the hall, while the leader moved towards Lily's room. Elias had to move now. He took a deep breath and vaulted over the nurse's station. He landed in a low crouch, the shears swinging loosely from his fist. The coverman saw him. "Contact!" he shouted, bringing his rifle to bear. Elias didn't run at him. He ran away from him, down a side corridor leading to the supply linen closet, the very place Finch had sent him to count bedpans. It seemed like a lifetime ago. The attacker followed, as Elias knew he would, drawn into the narrower confines, separated from his partner. It was a classic funneling tactic. The corridor was dark, lit only by a single emergency light at the far end. The attacker rounded the corner. He saw Elias standing 20 feet away, seemingly trapped. He smiled under his balaclava. "Nowhere to run, old man," he hissed. Elias didn't run. He braced himself against the wall and kicked out with his good leg. He wasn't aiming for the attacker. He was aiming for the large industrial fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. His heel struck the release latch perfectly. The heavy CO2 extinguisher shot off its mount and flew across the narrow hall, a red metal projectile. It struck the gunman square in the chest with a heavy, metallic thud, knocking the wind out of him and making him stagger back. In that split second of disorientation, Elias closed the distance. The makeshift flail whistled through the air. The sharp points of the surgical shears caught the man on the side of his neck, tearing through fabric and flesh. The man gargled, dropping his rifle, hands flying to the gushing wound. Elias didn't stop. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, slamming him back against the wall. He grabbed the man's head and slammed it. Once, twice, 3 times against the concrete wall with brutal, rhythmic efficiency. The man went limp, sliding to the floor in a heap. 2 down. A single gunshot echoed from the main hall. The leader. He'd reached room 407. Elias sprinted back out of the corridor. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. The leader had shot the lock on Lily's door and kicked it open. He was just stepping inside. The mother's scream from within the room was a sound of pure, primal terror. The situation had escalated. The last attacker was in the room with the asset and a civilian. A hostage situation. Elias slowed his breathing, forcing the adrenaline to serve him, not control him. He crept toward the open doorway of room 407, his footsteps utterly silent on the linoleum. He flattened himself against the wall beside the doorframe, listening. "Don't move!" the attacker was shouting inside. "Get away from the girl! Get over there! Against the wall!" He could hear the mother sobbing, pleading. "Please don't hurt her. She's just a baby. She just had surgery." "Shut up," the man snarled. "You, kid, you're coming with me." Elias peered around the edge of the doorframe for a fraction of a second. A sliver view. The room was small. The attacker was between the bed and the door, his back partially to the entrance. He was trying to grab the frightened child from the bed. The mother was being forced into the far corner. The geometry was bad. A straight-on assault was too risky for the child. He needed a distraction. His eyes scanned the hallway. He saw Dr. Finch, still huddled behind the planter, his face buried in his hands. "Finch!" Elias's voice was a whip-crack. Finch flinched, looking up, his eyes glassy with terror. "The fire alarm!" "Pull it," Elias commanded. Finch just stared at him, uncomprehending. "Pull the fire alarm! Now!" The command wasn't a request. It was a detonation. It bypassed reason and compelled obedience. Finch, acting on pure instinct, scrambled to his feet, ran to the nearest red alarm box on the wall, and yanked the lever down. An ear-splitting klaxon began to blare, and strobe lights flashed, bathing the hallway in frantic pulses of red. Inside room 407, the sudden sensory assault worked. The attacker flinched, instinctively turning his head towards the door for a second to assess the new threat. It was the only opening Elias would get. He exploded into the room. He didn't go for the man's weapon, he went for the man. He launched himself across the small space, his body a missile. He slammed into the attacker, driving him sideways, away from the child. The two men crashed into a rolling vital signs monitor. The machine toppled with a crash of plastic and electronics. The attacker was strong, fighting back with vicious elbow strikes. He still had his rifle, though it was pinned between their bodies. They grappled, a desperate, close-quarters struggle. Elias could smell the man's sweat, see the murderous rage in his eyes through the balaclava's cutout. Elias slammed the heel of his palm up under the man's chin, snapping his head back. At the same time, he hooked his leg, his bad leg, around the man's ankle and twisted. They went down in a tangled heap, the rifle discharging into the floor with a deafening roar. The mother screamed. Lily was crying. The attacker was trying to bring the rifle barrel around to bear on Elias's chest. Elias's left hand, the one with the tremor, shot out and clamped onto the rifle's ejection port. It was a suicidal move, but it was decisive. As the attacker pulled the trigger again, the rifle tried to cycle a new round. Elias's fingers, jammed into the mechanism, blocked the spent casing from ejecting. The rifle was jammed, a stovepipe malfunction. The attacker stared at the jammed weapon in disbelief. Elias used the moment. He drove his forehead into the bridge of the man's nose with a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The man grunted in pain, his grip loosening. Elias wrenched the rifle away and brought the stock up in a brutal upward strike that caught the man under the jaw. There was a crack, and the man went limp. 3 down. The room was suddenly, shockingly silent, save for the blaring fire alarm, the crying child, and Elias's own ragged breathing. He was on his knees, the rifle in his hand. Blood from his forehead, where the attacker's helmet had grazed him, was dripping onto the floor. He looked up. The mother was huddled in the corner, staring at him with a mixture of terror and awe. Lily was sitting up in her bed, her wide, frightened eyes locked on him. Elias's gaze softened. The killer receded, and the nurse, the real nurse, the protector, surfaced. He dropped the rifle, the clatter loud in the room. He raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. "It's okay," he rasped, his voice returning to its familiar quiet gravel. "You're safe now. Everything is going to be okay." He pushed himself to his feet, his hip screaming in protest. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and the pain was returning with a vengeance. He walked over to the fire alarm panel in the room and, with a practiced motion, silenced the local klaxon. The main hallway alarm still blared. He turned back to the mother and child. "I'm a nurse here," he said softly. "Let me check her." He approached the bed slowly. Lily, who had been crying, quieted as he came near. She looked at the blood on his face, then at his gentle eyes. He reached out, and his hand, the one that had just crushed a man's larynx and jammed a rifle, gently smoothed the hair back from her forehead. "You were very brave," he whispered. Suddenly, Dr. Finch appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his expensive suit disheveled. He stared at the scene, the unconscious attacker on the floor, the shattered equipment, and Elias, the lowly, incompetent orderly, standing over the patient like a guardian angel forged in hell. Finch's mind, unable to process the reality of what had happened, defaulted to its factory settings: arrogance and misplaced authority. "Thorne, what have you done?" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "You've brought this violence into my ward. You assaulted this man." He pointed a trembling finger at the unconscious attacker. Elias turned to look at him. His face was a calm, blood-streaked mask. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Finch, and in his eyes, Finch saw something that terrified him more than the gunman had. He saw a complete and utter absence of fear. He saw a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and had found it wanting. "Get away from that child," Finch stammered, trying to reclaim some shred of his shattered authority. "You are not qualified. You are a danger." Elias took a slow step towards him. Finch flinched back as if he'd been struck. "The floor is secure, Doctor," Elias said, his voice flat and cold. "My patient, however, is not. She's post-op from a Blalock-Tausig shunt revision. The stress of this event could induce a hypertensive crisis and blow the graft. Her medication is in the main dispensary, which is outside this lockdown. We have approximately 30 minutes before she'll need her next dose of intravenous beta blockers, or her heart rate will redline." Finch just stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The technical precision, the calm diagnosis of the tactical and medical situation. It wasn't coming from the shuffling ghost he knew. "The police will be here soon," Finch finally managed. "The police are outside," Elias corrected him calmly. "They'll establish a perimeter. SWAT will take 20 to 30 minutes to gear up and another 20 to make a plan. They won't breach a potential hostage situation without intel. We are on our own. And the clock is ticking for this little girl." He glanced back at Lily, his expression softening for a moment, then his eyes went back to Finch, hard as diamonds. "So you have two choices. You can stand there and continue to be a useless, terrified liability. Or you can retrieve the crash cart from the hallway, bring it here, and help me keep this child alive. Your call, Doctor." The way he said the word doctor was not a sign of respect. It was a weapon. It was a challenge. For the first time in his life, Dr. Alistair Finch was utterly, completely, and humiliatingly out of his depth. The ghost he had tormented for 3 years was now in command, and the entire world had turned upside down. The blare of the fire alarm from the hallway was a maddening, rhythmic pulse. Red lights flashed, painting the scene in surreal, bloody strokes. Dr. Finch, stripped of his bravado, was a deer in the headlights, his mind refusing to accept the new hierarchy that had been brutally established. He looked from Elias's blood-streaked, impassive face to the unconscious commando on the floor, then back again. His world had crumbled. The janitorial nurse was giving him orders. The crash cart? Finch stammered, the words catching in his throat. It's in the main corridor, where I left it, Elias said, his voice devoid of patience. It has a portable ECG, a defibrillator, and a basic drug kit. We need to monitor her vitals continuously. Go. The command, sharp and absolute, finally broke Finch's paralysis. He stumbled out of the room, a man in a daze. The sight that greeted him in the hallway was a tableau of chaos. Nurses and a few family members were huddled against the walls, their faces a mixture of fear and astonishment. They were all staring at the doorway to room 407, at Elias. They had all heard his commands, seen his transformation. The ward's ghost had become its sentinel. Elias turned his attention back to the room. The mother was now by Lily's side, stroking her hair, whispering reassurances. Elias knelt and quickly, expertly checked the unconscious attacker. He found a zip tie in the man's tactical vest and used it to secure his hands behind his back. He checked the man's pulse. Strong. He'd have a concussion and a broken jaw, but he would live. Elias felt a brief, cold flicker of disappointment. He stood up and addressed the mother. "Ma'am, I need you to be strong. I need you to help me. What is her real name?" The woman looked at him, her haunted eyes searching his.
She saw no threat there.
Only a deep, weary competence. "Her name is Sophie," she whispered. "Her father he's a diplomat." Elias nodded. It confirmed his suspicion. This wasn't random. It was a targeted abduction attempt. "Okay, Sophie is a beautiful name. Now, Sophie is going to be fine, but we need to keep her calm." Finch reappeared, clumsily pushing the crash cart into the room. One of the wheels was sticking, and he struggled with it, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He looked at the attacker, now hogtied on the floor, and visibly shuddered. "All right, Doctor," Elias said, his tone all business. "Hook her up to the ECG. I want continuous monitoring of her heart rate and blood pressure. Set the alarm parameters for a heart rate above 140 and a systolic pressure over 130. Finch, on autopilot, began to fumble with the electrodes. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely peel the backing off. Elias watched him for a second, his expression unreadable. "Let me," Elias said, gently but firmly, pushing him aside. With practiced, efficient movements, he attached the leads to Sophie's chest and arms. He powered on the monitor, his fingers flying across the keypad as he programmed the alarm settings. The screen flickered to life, showing a steady sinus rhythm. But it was fast. 130 beats per minute. Too fast. "She's tachycardic. The stress is getting to her," Elias said, more to himself than to anyone else. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 25 minutes. He opened the drug drawer on the crash cart. It was stocked with emergency medications, epinephrine, atropine, lidocaine. The basics, but not what he needed. "The labetalol," Elias stated, looking at Finch. "It's in the automated Pyxis machine at the nurse's station. You'll need your access code." Finch shook his head. "The machine is down. The whole network is down. When they shot the console, it must have fried the server connection." Elias's jaw tightened.
A complication.
A serious one. "Is there a manual override key?" "Yes, but the head nurse, Mrs. Gable, has it. She went home an hour ago." A cascade of institutional failures. Elias felt a familiar cold fury rise in him. This was how people died, not from the bullets, but from the bureaucracy. Okay, new plan. His mind raced, sifting through pharmacological alternatives. Is there any amiodarone on this cart? Finch rummaged through the drawer. Yes, 2 pre-filled syringes. It's not ideal. It's a dirty drug for this condition, but it will slow her heart rate. It'll buy us time, Elias said. He prepared the syringe, checked the dosage. We need to push it slow, very slow. Too fast, and we'll put her into cardiac arrest. He handed the syringe to Finch. You do it. I'll watch the monitor. Go slow, doctor, I mean it. Finch took the syringe, his hand trembling violently. He approached the IV port in Sophie's arm. He was sweating profusely, his pristine white coat now stained and wrinkled. He looked at the tiny port, then at the syringe, then at Elias. He couldn't do it. The pressure, the fear, the complete role reversal, it had broken him. I can't, he whispered, his voice a pathetic whimper. My hands. I can't. Elias stared at him for a long, silent moment. It wasn't disgust on his face, or even anger. It was a kind of profound, weary pity. He had seen men break before. Brave men. Finch was not a brave man. Step aside, Elias said softly. He took the syringe from Finch's nerveless fingers. He knelt by Sophie's bed. His own left hand had its familiar tremor, but as his right hand held the syringe, it was as steady as a rock. It's okay, Sophie, he murmured, his eyes on the girl's face. Just a little medicine to help you rest. He began to depress the plunger, infinitesimally slowly, his gaze flicking between the girl and the ECG monitor. The green line on the screen wavered. Her heart rate began, ever so slowly, to tick downwards. 128, 125, 120. Suddenly, a new sound from the hallway. Shouting. Not from the nurses. A new voice. Male. Authoritative. This is the police. We know you're in there. We have the building surrounded. Elias ignored it. His focus was absolute. The monitor. The syringe. The child. Come out with your hands up. The man who came with you is in custody. Elias froze. The man who came with him? They thought he was one of the attackers. Of course they did. A man in blood-stained scrubs, holding a rifle, standing over subdued hostiles. The picture was damning. Finch's eyes widened. He saw an opportunity, a way to reclaim his narrative, his power. His cowardly, opportunistic mind seized it. He bolted from the room. "Help!" he screamed, running down the hall toward the barricaded main doors. "Help me! He's in here! The terrorist! He has a child! He's trying to kill her!" The ultimate betrayal. Elias watched him go, a cold certainty settling in his gut. He had just saved this man's life. He was actively saving a child's life. And Finch had just signed his death warrant. The SWAT team outside would now be operating under the assumption that he was the primary hostile, holding a child hostage. Their rules of engagement had just changed. Deadly force was now authorized. The situation had just become infinitely more complicated. The clock was ticking on Sophie's heart, and now a new clock had started ticking on his own life. The world outside room 407 erupted. Finch's frantic, self-serving screams had reshaped the tactical landscape. To the unseen SWAT operators staging in the stairwell, the scenario had clarified into a nightmare. A confirmed hostile, a child hostage, and a direct threat to the hostage's life. The time for negotiation was over. The time for a dynamic breach was imminent. Inside the room, Elias didn't panic. Panic was a fire that consumed oxygen and options. He operated in the cold vacuum of pure, unflinching logic. He finished administering the amiodarone, his movements precise and economical, never taking his eyes off the monitor. The rhythmic beep of the ECG slowed to a more stable rate. 110 beats per minute, still high, but no longer in the red zone. He had bought time, maybe an hour, maybe less. Sophie's mother was staring at the doorway where Finch had disappeared, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. He told them you're— I know, Elias said, his voice a low calm in the storm of the alarms and shouting. He stood up and moved to the door, peering cautiously down the hall. He could see Finch gesticulating wildly, talking to someone through the wired glass of the main ward doors. He was painting a picture, a self-serving masterpiece of lies. Elias knew what a breach looked like. It would be fast, violent, and indiscriminate. They'd use flashbangs. They'd come in hard and fast, and they would shoot the first perceived threat to the hostage. He was that threat. His blood-soaked scrubs, the downed commandos, Finch's testimony, it all added up to his execution. He had to control the narrative. He had to communicate. But how? The hospital phones were dead. His own cell phone was in his locker downstairs, a world away. He turned back into the room. His eyes swept over the downed attacker's gear. The man had a radio clipped to his vest. Elias knelt, his fingers expertly unclipping it. He checked the frequency dial. It was a commercial-grade encrypted radio, useless for talking to the police. But he noticed a small, almost invisible wire running from the radio to an earpiece still in the man's ear. He pulled it out. It was a standard 3.5mm jack. An idea sparked in his mind, a desperate, long-shot gamble. He looked at the vital signs monitor he and Finch had knocked over.
It was shattered.
But the power cord was intact, still plugged into the wall socket. He ripped the cord from the wall. Then, using the surgical shears he still had tucked in his belt, he stripped the plastic insulation off the end of the cord, exposing the copper wires within. He did the same to the radio's earpiece wire. It was delicate work. His left hand trembled, but his right was surgeon's steady. He twisted the fine earpiece wires onto the heavier copper strands of the power cord. He had just turned the entire electrical wiring of the hospital into a massive, crude antenna. He switched the radio on. Static. He began to slowly turn the frequency dial, listening intently. He was bypassing the encryption, trying to catch a stray, unencrypted signal from the police band. Static. Static. A burst of chatter. Static. All units be advised, primary suspect is a male, late 40s, wearing hospital scrubs, considered armed and extremely dangerous. Hostage is a female child.
Repeat.
Hostage is a female child. Elias's jaw tightened. Finch's poison was already spreading. He keyed the microphone. This is Nurse Thorne in the pediatric ward. I am with the hostage. She is stable, but she is a critical cardiac patient. Do not breach. I repeat, do not breach. You will kill her. His voice was a low, urgent rasp. A burst of static. Then a new voice, laced with suspicion. Identify yourself. Thorne is the name of the suspect. I am the suspect, Elias said calmly. I am also the only thing keeping this child alive. The men who stormed this ward are neutralized. They are unconscious and secured. The hostage-taker is the doctor who is speaking to you. He is trying to cover for his own incompetence and cowardice. A pause on the other end. He could imagine their confusion. This wasn't in the playbook. "Sir," another voice cut in on the police channel, younger, more excited. "Sir, we're getting a secondary report. A VIP alert just came down from the Joint Chiefs. They're routing a military command unit to this location. Priority Alpha." "A military unit? For a hospital shooter?" the first voice asked, confused. "I don't know, sir. The order is coming from the Pentagon directly. They're saying a national asset is compromised at this location." Elias's blood ran cold. He knew what that meant. The diplomat, Sophie's father, was more than a diplomat. And a national asset being compromised meant the response would not be a police action. It would be a military one, and the rules of engagement would be even more severe. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air, louder than the sirens, more powerful than the howling wind. It was the deep, percussive whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of heavy-lift helicopter blades. Not a police or news chopper. The sound was deeper, heavier. A military bird. They were already here. That was impossibly fast. Elias moved to the window. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but through the deluge, he could see them. 2 MH-60 Black Hawks, painted matte black, devoid of any markings, were descending toward the hospital roof. They weren't landing. They were hovering, preparing for a fast rope insertion. This changed everything. This wasn't SWAT. This was a Tier 1 response. These were men from his world. They wouldn't listen to a local police frequency. They would be on their own encrypted network. He was locked out again, and they would be coming down with one objective: neutralize the threat to the asset at all costs. He looked at Sophie, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the beeping monitor. He looked at the unconscious commandos. He looked at the makeshift radio in his hand. He was out of time and out of options. Then his eyes fell on the last attacker, the one whose jaw he had broken. On the man's tactical vest, next to an empty magazine pouch, was a small, Velcro-backed patch. It was a call sign patch, something mercenaries and private contractors often wore. The patch had a single, stylized image on it: a skeletal dragon. The Dragon of Herat. Elias felt a shock go through him, a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with electricity. He knew that symbol. It was the insignia of a notorious private military company, a group of ex-Special Forces washouts who sold their services to the highest bidder. He had crossed paths with them once before, in a dusty, forgotten corner of Afghanistan. And he knew their commander. A new, even more desperate plan formed in his mind. He knelt beside the unconscious leader and rifled through his pockets. He found a satellite phone. It was top of the line, military grade. He powered it on. It took a moment to acquire a signal, its small screen glowing in the dim light. He accessed the recent call log. There was only one number, labeled Command. His finger hovered over the call button. He was about to call the man who sent these killers. It was insane. It was suicide. But it was the only move he had left. He was no longer trying to talk to the rescuers. He was going to talk to the enemy. He pressed the button. The satellite phone rang once, twice, then a voice answered. It was a voice Elias recognized instantly, a gravelly baritone laced with expensive whiskey and casual brutality. "Viper, report. Is the package secure?" Elias took a breath. "This isn't Viper," he said, his voice a low, cold whisper. "He's been detained." There was a dead, shocked silence on the other end of the line. The only sound was the distant whomp, whomp of the Black Hawks hovering over the roof. "Who is this?" the voice finally demanded, all pretense of calm gone. Elias allowed himself a small, grim smile. The board was set. The pieces were in motion. "You know who this is, Dmitri?" he rasped. "You left me for dead outside of Kandahar, you and your dragons. Now, your men are in my house."
And I'm very unhappy.
The arrival of the black helicopters changed the atmosphere outside the hospital from a localized crisis to a major federal incident. The local police chief, a portly man named Henderson, whose biggest concern an hour ago was budget allocation for new patrol cars, now found himself utterly sidelined. Men in dark suits and earpieces emerged from a fleet of black SUVs that had screeched to a halt at the emergency room entrance, creating a secondary, more imposing perimeter inside the police line. They moved with an unnerving, quiet authority, their eyes constantly scanning, their presence sucking the air out of the rainy night. At the center of this new storm stood one man. He stepped out of the lead SUV, and the world seemed to hold its breath. He was tall, in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the wind. He wore a perfectly tailored military dress uniform, even in the pouring rain, the chest laden with a breathtaking array of ribbons and medals. On his shoulders were 4 silver stars. General Marcus Thorne, commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. He didn't look at the police chief. He didn't look at the milling FBI agents. His gaze was fixed on the 4th floor of the hospital, his expression unreadable, his jaw set like a vice. An aide, a young colonel holding a satellite phone and a tablet, hurried to his side. "General," the colonel said, his voice tight, "we have a situation. The local PD is reporting a single hostile, name of Thorne, holding a child hostage, but we have a high-value asset, Sophie de Villiers, daughter of the French ambassador, on that floor. The hostile is demanding we stand down, claiming the child is medically unstable." General Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly. The name. Thorne. A common enough name, but in this context, it was a lightning bolt. "And the local doctor?" the general asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Dr. Alastair Finch. He's the one who identified the hostile. He's claiming the man is a disgruntled nurse who went berserk," the colonel reported. "He's very insistent." "Put him on screen," the general commanded. The colonel tapped his tablet, and a live video feed from a SWAT officer's body cam appeared. It showed Dr. Finch, his face wild with a mixture of terror and a strange, manic excitement. He was pointing at the 4th floor windows. "He's a monster, a psycho. He attacked those poor men who were just trying to—" Finch's narrative was crumbling under its own absurdity, but his core message was clear. Elias was the villain. General Thorne watched the screen for 3 seconds, his expression unchanging. Then he said 2 words. "Turn it off." The colonel complied instantly. "Get me a direct line to the breach team on the roof. Now," the general ordered. "Sir, they're preparing for a dynamic entry. On your command." "Tell them to hold," the general said. "Hold their position. No breach until I give the word. No exceptions." "But, sir, the asset—" "I am aware of the asset, Colonel," General Thorne said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "I am also aware of the name Thorne. Now get me that line." The colonel, chastened, worked his equipment. A moment later, he handed the sat phone to the general. "Raptor 1 is on, sir." "Raptor 1, this is Olympus," the general said, using the highest level command call sign. "What's your status?" "Olympus, Raptor 1 is on the roof, standing by for entry. A calm, professional voice replied from the earpiece. We have eyes on the fourth-floor windows, no sign of the hostile. Raptor 1, I want you to change your mission profile. You are no longer a breach team. You are a recovery team, the general stated. There was a pause. Sir, recovery of the asset? Negative, the general said, his voice hardening. Your primary objective is to recover a friendly operative. Codename Hades. He may be non-compliant. Your secondary objective is the asset, Sophie de Villiers. The designated hostile, this Nurse Thorne, is not to be engaged. I repeat, do not engage. He is under my personal protection. Acknowledge. The silence on the other end was profound. The leader of the most elite Special Forces unit in the world had just been told that the man they were sent to kill was, in fact, one of their own, a legendary figure they all knew by reputation, if not by name. Hades was a ghost story they told rookie operators, a near-mythical combat medic who had more confirmed saves in impossible situations than any man alive. Olympus. Acknowledged, Raptor 1 finally said, his voice laced with awe. We are standing by for recovery of Hades. The general handed the phone back to his aide. His gaze was still locked on the fourth floor. He knew his son. He knew the demons that had driven him out of the service and into this self-imposed exile. He also knew that if Elias was in that room, the situation was both far more dangerous and far more controlled than anyone here could possibly comprehend. Just then, another aide ran up, holding a phone. General, we have him. The hostile negotiator just got a call from the suspect. We're patching it through to you now. General Thorne took the phone. He heard a strange, static-filled silence, and then a voice. His son's voice. But it wasn't directed at him. It was cold, menacing, and speaking to someone else entirely. You left me for dead outside of Kandahar, Dmitri, the voice rasped. Now your men are in my house, and I'm very unhappy. A wave of understanding washed over the general. Elias wasn't negotiating with the police. He had bypassed the entire chain of command. He had gone straight to the source. It was the boldest, most insane tactical move the general had ever witnessed, and it was pure, undiluted Elias. The general keyed the mic. Son, he said, his voice softer than anyone had heard it all night. On the other end of the line, in the chaos of room 407, Elias froze. He had expected to hear the oily, panicked voice of Dmitry Volkov, the PMC commander. Instead, he heard the one voice that could still cut through his armor, the voice of his father. Dad? The word was a breath, a whisper of disbelief. I'm here, Elias, the general said, his voice thick with emotion he dared not show. I'm on the ground. My men are on the roof. We're coming to get you. Just hold on. Dad, the girl... Elias's voice was urgent now, the cold killer replaced by the desperate medic. She's critical. The local doctor is a liability. He's fed you lies. I need a real medical team, a pediatric cardiac specialist, and I need them 5 minutes ago. They're on their way, the general assured him. We have the best. They're coming with my team. Just tell me what you need me to do. Elias looked at the sat phone in his other hand, the open line to Dmitry Volkov still active. He looked at the door. He looked at Sophie, sleeping fitfully on the bed. He had all the pieces. Now it was time to end the game. Keep your men on the roof, Elias commanded, his voice shifting back to tactical precision. Do not breach. I'm going to end this, and I'm going to do it publicly. The man who caused all this, Dr. Finch, is with your people at the main door. I want him brought to the ward entrance. I want him to see this." "Elias, what are you planning?" the general asked, a note of concern in his voice.
"Justice,"
Elias replied, his voice as cold as a tombstone. "The kind they don't teach in medical school?" He clicked off the line to his father, leaving the general staring at a dead phone, a sense of profound dread and fierce pride warring within him. Elias took a breath and put the satellite phone back to his ear. "Dimitri," he said into the phone, "you and I are going to have a conversation, and you're going to do exactly what I say, or the next thing you hear will be the sound of the French government revoking every contract you have and putting a kill or capture order on your entire company, starting with you." The public humiliation of Dr. Alistair Finch did not begin with a shout, but with a quiet, terrifying order. Down in the lobby, surrounded by a cordon of General Thorne's unsmiling men in suits, Finch was in the middle of a grand, self-aggrandizing performance for the benefit of the police chief. And then, with no thought for my own safety, I drew the terrorists' fire. "Allowing the nurses to escape," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with false bravado. He's clearly ex-military, completely unstable. I did my best to de-escalate, but his psychosis was too advanced. One of the suits stepped forward, his face impassive. "Dr. Finch, the general wants to see you." Finch preened. Of course the general wanted to see him, to thank him, to commend him for his heroism. "Naturally," he said, straightening his tie, "lead the way." He was not led to the command post. He was escorted, firmly, back toward the elevators, flanked by two men who moved with the fluid grace of predators. They took him up to the 4th floor. The hallway, when the elevator doors opened, was eerily quiet. The fire alarm had been silenced. The flashing red lights were off. The emergency lighting cast long, distorted shadows. The nurses and families were gone, evacuated by a secondary team. The only people present were a half-dozen more men in dark suits, all of them standing with their backs to the wall, all of them watching him. At the far end of the hall, standing before the barricaded main doors to the ward, was General Thorne. He stood alone, a figure of immense, silent power. As Finch approached, his confident stride began to falter. The general's expression was not one of gratitude. It was one of cold, concentrated rage. "General Thorne," Finch began, extending a hand. "Dr. Alistair Finch, it's an honor, a terrible situation, but I'm glad I could be of service." General Thorne did not take his hand. He simply stared at him, his eyes like chips of ice. "You were of service, Doctor," the general said, his voice a low growl. "You served as a prime example of everything wrong with men who value their reputation over the lives of others." Finch's smile froze on his face. I don't understand." "You will," the general said. He nodded to one of his men, who handed him a tablet. The screen showed a satellite image of a sprawling villa in a tropical location. "This is the home of Dmitry Volkov, owner of the private military company Dragon Corps. 10 minutes ago, Mr. Volkov made a phone call to the French ambassador. In that call, he confessed to orchestrating the attempted kidnapping of the ambassador's daughter, Sophie de Villiers. He named his corporate sponsors. He gave up his entire network. He then walked outside and surrendered to a local tactical team that had been, by sheer coincidence, practicing drills a mile from his home." The general looked up from the tablet, his eyes boring into Finch. Mr. Volkov was motivated to do this. He was motivated by a man on a satellite phone, a man who gave him two options: cooperate or have his location and identity leaked to every intelligence agency and terrorist group he's ever double-crossed. The man on that phone knew things about Mr. Volkov that even I didn't know. Finch was pale, confused. What does this have to do with me? That man on the phone, the general continued, his voice dropping lower. The man who single-handedly neutralized 3 professional commandos, saved the life of a critically ill child, and dismantled an international criminal enterprise from a hospital supply closet, was the man you identified as a psychotic terrorist. The man you sent my team to kill. The truth slammed into Finch with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, his face ashen. No, Thorn? It can't be. He's a nobody. He's a failed nurse. He is Master Sergeant Elias Thorn, the general's voice boomed, echoing in the silent hall. Recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and a Medal of Honor nominee. He was the senior combat medic for the most elite special operations unit this country has. He has saved more lives on the battlefield than you have in your pristine, air-conditioned operating rooms. He is not a failed nurse. He is a hero who was trying to find peace. The general took a step closer, his shadow falling over Finch. And you with your expensive watch and your fancy degree, you bullied him, you humiliated him. And when the moment came, when your courage was tested, you didn't just fail, you didn't just cower. You actively tried to get him killed to save your own pathetic career. You are a disgrace, not just to your profession, but to the human race. As if on cue, there was a sound from behind them. The barricade in front of the ward doors was being moved aside. The doors opened. Elias Thorn stood there. He had wiped the blood from his face, but his scrubs were still stained. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline having long since faded, leaving behind only the deep, weary ache of his old wounds. Behind him, a team of military medics, the real deal, calm and hyper-competent, were working on Sophie, preparing her for transport. One of them, a woman with captain's bars on her collar, looked up and gave Elias a nod of profound respect. Elias's eyes found Finch. He didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked tired. He took a step forward, his limp more pronounced than ever. He stopped in front of the trembling doctor. The hallway was dead silent. All the suits, the general, everyone was watching. Finch started to babble, his voice high and shrill. "I didn't know. How could I know? You have to believe me. It was a mistake, a misunderstanding." Elias just looked at him. Then he raised his left hand, the one with the tremor. He held it up between them. The shaking was visible in the dim light. "This tremor," Elias rasped, his voice quiet but carrying in the silence. "You mocked it."
You said it was a weakness.
He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, misshapen piece of metal. It was a flattened piece of shrapnel. "This is from an IED that killed 3 men standing next to me. It's been working its way out of my shoulder for 10 years. The tremor is from the nerve damage." He dropped the piece of metal. It clattered loudly on the floor. "My voice," he continued, his tone unchanging. "You said it sounded like a death rattle. You're right. It's the sound of my own larynx, scarred from shrapnel when I shielded a wounded ranger from a grenade. He lived. I got this voice." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "My limp. My shuffling. A bullet shattered my hip while I was dragging our platoon leader out of a firefight. I set the bone myself and then spent the next 6 hours keeping 10 other wounded men alive until sunrise." He took one more step, until he was inches from Finch's face. "You have no idea what weakness is, Doctor," Elias whispered. You are a hollow man, a coward in a white coat, and you are not fit to treat children. You are not fit to treat anyone." With that, he turned his back on the man and walked toward his father. General Thorne watched him come, his granite face softening with a father's pride and pain. He put a hand on Elias's shoulder. "It's over, son. Let's go home." Two of the suits stepped forward and took Finch by the arms. He didn't resist. He was a broken man, whimpering softly, his reputation, his career, his entire sense of self utterly annihilated. They led him away, not to a police car, but toward a legal team from the Judge Advocate General's office. His ordeal was just beginning. The attempted murder of a special operator, even by proxy, was a military crime. Elias watched him go, then looked at the nurses and other staff who had gathered at the far end of the hall, their faces filled with awe and shame. Their ghost was gone. In his place stood a legend they had been too blind to see. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled, professional activity. The military medical team, led by the crisp, no-nonsense captain, had Sophie stabilized and packaged for transport within minutes. They moved with a quiet efficiency that made the hospital's normal operations look like chaos. They were transferring her not to another floor, but to the waiting Black Hawk on the roof, destined for Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. The best care in the world. As they wheeled her past, the gurney flanked by operators in full kit, Sophie's mother paused. She rushed to Elias, ignoring the formidable presence of the general, and threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she sobbed into his stained scrubs. "You saved her. You saved my baby." Elias, unused to such open displays of emotion, stood stiffly for a moment before patting her awkwardly on the back. "I was just doing my job, ma'am," he rasped. It was the first time he had said that phrase in years, and truly meant it in the old way. The general put a gentle hand on her arm. "He needs to get checked out himself, ma'am. We'll make sure you're updated on Sophie's condition every step of the way." She nodded, gave Elias one last grateful look, and hurried to join her daughter. Once they were gone, the general turned his full attention to his son. He scanned him from head to toe, the commander's eye missing nothing. The exhaustion, the fresh cut on his forehead, the way he favored his bad hip more than usual, the dried blood under his fingernails. "You're a mess, Elias," he said, his voice gruff to hide the overwhelming relief. "You should see the other guys," Elias quipped, a flash of the old dry humor surfacing. It was a weak joke, but for the two of them, it was a bridge across years of distance and pain. The general's mouth tightened into something that might have been a smile. "Let's get you out of here. There's a debriefing. The president wants a personal report." Elias shook his head. "No. No debriefing, no report. That's your world, Dad, not mine anymore." He looked around the now empty, quiet hallway. It looked sterile again, almost as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. "I'm done." "Done with the hospital? Son, after this they'll probably offer you Finch's job. They'll name the wing after you." "I don't want it," Elias said firmly. "I came here to be invisible, to be quiet. I failed." He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had saved and had taken life in the same hour. "I can't be here anymore. They'll never look at me the same way. I'll never be Nurse Thorne again. I'll be that." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the entire violent episode. A profound sadness settled in the general's eyes. He understood. His son had tried to bury the warrior, but the warrior had refused to stay dead. "So what will you do?" Before Elias could answer, Nurse Davies, the young nurse who had seen the first takedown, approached them hesitantly. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but she held herself with a new maturity. "Master Sergeant Thorne," she said, the rank sounding foreign and important on her lips. We, the rest of the staff, we wanted to apologize for how we treated you. We were blind, and we were cruel, and we're so sorry." Elias looked at her, and for the first time, a genuine, small smile touched his lips. "There's nothing to apologize for, Davies. You just saw a nurse having a bad day." He turned to go. "Wait," she said, holding out a small object. It was the crushed paper espresso cup that Finch had thrown in the sink. She had retrieved it. "You never got to have your coffee." It was a small, absurd gesture, but it was also everything. It was an acknowledgement of the petty injustice that had preceded the life-and-death struggle. Elias looked at the cup, then at her. He took it. "Thank you, nurse," he said. And the way he said, "nurse," was filled with a respect he had never shown Finch. It was a validation of her, a quiet acknowledgement of her place in the world of healing he was about to leave behind. He and the general walked toward the elevators, the team of suits falling in behind them. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar. As the elevator doors opened, Elias paused and looked back one last time at the pediatric ward, the place of his penance, the place of his violent resurrection. He felt a pang of loss for the quiet ghost he had been. That man was gone forever. "You know," the general said softly as the elevator descended, "the training program for the new generation of pararescue jumpers and combat medics, it's been having issues. The instructors are good, but they lack a certain perspective. They teach the medicine, but they don't teach the mindset. They don't teach how to hold it together when the world is ending." Elias looked at his father, understanding dawning in his eyes. It wasn't an order. It was an offer, a path forward. "I'm not a soldier anymore, Dad." "I'm not asking for a soldier," the general replied. "I'm asking for a teacher, a master sergeant who can teach the new kids how to be a ghost when they need to be, and how to be a reaper when there's no other choice." The elevator doors opened to the chaotic lobby. Elias looked at the reflection of himself and his father in the polished steel. He didn't see a failure anymore. He didn't see a ghost. He saw a tired man with a lot of scars. But he also saw a flicker of purpose in his own eyes, the kind he hadn't seen since Kandahar. Maybe his war wasn't over. Maybe it had just found a new battlefield, not one of blood and sand, but one of knowledge and legacy. 6 months later, the Saint. Jude's general pediatric ward was brighter, warmer. A large brass plaque was mounted on the wall near the nurse's station. It read, "The Master Sergeant Elias Thorne Center for Pediatric Trauma Care." The hospital board, in a fit of damage control and genuine admiration, had not only fired Finch, but had poured millions into renovating and rebranding the ward. Dr. Alastair Finch, after a military tribunal found him guilty of conduct unbecoming, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of a military operation, had been stripped of his medical license and was currently serving a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary, a place where his expensive watch and fancy degrees earned him nothing but contempt. The nurses spoke of the Night of the Ghost in hushed, reverent tones. It had become hospital legend. Nurse Davies was now the head nurse, her promotion fast-tracked after she demonstrated extraordinary grace under pressure. She ran the ward with a quiet competence and a fierce intolerance for arrogance in any form. She kept a small, crushed paper cup on her desk, a silent reminder of the lessons learned. Elias Thorne was not there to see any of it. He was hundreds of miles away, standing on a dusty firing range under a blazing desert sun. He was wearing tactical pants and a simple t-shirt, a ball cap pulled low over his eyes. His limp was barely noticeable today. The pain was still there, a dull companion, but it no longer defined him. In front of him, a dozen young, cocky Air Force pararescue jumpers, PJs, were gathered, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. They had just finished a brutal mass casualty drill, and they were exhausted. "All right, listen up," Elias's voice rasped, cutting through their weary murmurs. It was the same quiet voice, but now it held an undeniable weight of authority. They hung on his every word. Medicine in the field isn't about what you know, it's about what you can do when everything you know is wrong. When your gear is broken, when your patient is crashing, and when the man who is supposed to be in charge is a screaming coward. He paced in front of them, his movements slow and deliberate. "You did okay today. You followed the protocol. But protocol is a suggestion. It's a map for a place you may never get to. The real test is what you do when you're off the map." He stopped and looked them in the eye, one by one. "I'm not here to teach you how to be medics. They already did that. I'm here to teach you how to be the calmest man in the room when the room is on fire. I'm here to teach you how to be a ghost, how to see everything and be seen by no one. And I'm here to teach you that sometimes the best medical instrument at your disposal," he paused, letting the moment hang in the air, "is controlled, overwhelming violence. Your first priority is your patient, and you can't save your patient if the enemy gets to them first. Your duty is to be a healer, but sometimes to be a healer, you must first be a monster. Never forget that." A black SUV pulled up at the edge of the range. General Thorne got out, now retired, wearing civilian clothes. He watched his son, a proud, quiet smile on his face. Elias had found his way home, not to a house, but to a purpose. He was forging a new generation of ghosts, medics who understood the brutal duality of their calling. Later that day, Elias sat in the passenger seat as his father drove. They were on their way to a small, private airfield. "You heard about Sophie?" the general asked. Elias nodded. "I get updates from her mother every week. The surgery at Walter Reed was a success. She's playing soccer now." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "She sent me a drawing. It's of a big, scary ghost protecting a little girl from monsters." "Sounds about right," the general said gruffly. They arrived at the airfield, where a small private jet was waiting. A young girl with bright, laughing eyes came running down the steps. It was Sophie. Her parents, the ambassador and his wife, stood at the top of the stairs, smiling. They flew in once a month on their own dime, just so Sophie could spend an afternoon with the man who saved her life. Elias got out of the car, and Sophie launched herself into his arms. He caught her, swinging her up in a hug, his face buried in her hair. All the hardness, all the weariness seemed to melt away in that moment. He wasn't Master Sergeant Thorne, the legendary Hades. He wasn't the quiet, haunted ghost of St. Jude's. He was just Elias, a man holding a grateful child. As he stood there, the setting sun casting a long shadow behind him, he knew he had finally found a sort of peace. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they were quieter now. They had been joined by the ghost of a man who had found a new way to serve, a new way to heal. Not just the bodies of the wounded, but the spirit of the next generation of saviors. There are heroes all around us, hidden in plain sight. They are the quiet ones, the overlooked, the underestimated. They wear janitors' uniforms and nurses' scrubs. They carry the weight of unseen burdens and unspoken sacrifices. They ask for nothing, and they are prepared to give everything. The world may call them ghosts, but they are the pillars that hold it up. We would do well to see them.